with the world forgetting how China is getting rid of its Muslim problem. Their atrocities and cultural cleansing continue as the people are brainwashed into pledging their allegiance to the Communist Party of China. Despite the global outcry and lack of Islamic support for the Muslims in China, it is very clear that the terrorist groups who call themselves rebels, attempting to unite the world as an Islamic unit, are nothing more than political puppets. These groups have nothing to do with the people or religion, but everything to do with political power. Muslims are not new to atrocities. Sometimes they are the victims, and sometimes the oppressors. The media leads a massive outcry to sympathize even with terrorist groups by justifying their acts. But the atrocities they committed over time are not half as popular or important in the media. One such atrocity that was committed was the Assyrian Genocide, also referred to as Safo, meaning sword in Aramaic, was one such systematic massacre of the Assyrian people during World War I, which occurred primarily between 1914 and 1920 under the Ottoman Empire. This tragic event is often discussed in the same context as the Armenian and Greek genocides, as all three were perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire during the same period, and with similar genocidal intent. While the Assyrian Genocide has not received as much international attention as the Armenian Genocide, its impact was profound, both for the Assyrian people and for the region as a whole, as over 250,000 Assyrians, men, women, and children were brutally massacred by the Ottoman Empire. The Assyrians are an indigenous ethnic group native to Mesopotamia, a descendants of one of the oldest civilizations on earth, were a Christian minority living in the Ottoman Empire alongside Armenians and Greeks. But when the Young Turks came to power in 1908, they ignited a nationalistic dream, a dream to unify the empire under Turkish Muslim dominance. The Assyrian people were predominantly Christians, belonging to the Church of the East, Syriac Orthodox Church, and the Chaldean Catholic Church, and they lived in regions spanning modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Christians, seen as outsiders, became targets. As the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, suspicion turned to violence, and the sword was raised against the Assyrians. The Ottoman authorities, which was led by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, viewed Christian minorities as a threat to the empire's stability, believing they would side with Russia and the Allied powers. The empire was crumbling, and in its desperation, the regime resorted to genocide. Under the leadership of men like Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, a coordinated campaign of ethnic cleansing was launched against the Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. For the Assyrians, the onslaught was merciless. That large hyphen-scale massacres took place in Hakkari, Urmia, Van, and Mosul regions, where entire villages were wiped out. Men, women, and children were killed indiscriminately. Survivors often describe the brutal use of swords, which is why the term Safo is commonly used to describe the genocide. Assyrian women and girls were subjected to widespread sexual violence. Many were taken as slaves or forced into marriages with Muslim men, and the physical and psychological trauma inflicted upon these women was profound. Those who survived the initial massacres were herded like cattle into death marches. Families, barefoot and starving, were forced to walk hundreds of miles across scorching deserts. Starvation, dehydration, and disease ravaged them along the way. Thousands were perished, children dying in their mothers' arms, elders collapsing from exhaustion, their bodies abandoned by the side of the road. For many, there was no destination, only death. Over 200 Assyrian villages were systematically destroyed, and many churches and monasteries were looted and burned. The destruction of cultural and religious sites was intended to erase the Assyrian presence in the region. Assyrian Christians were often given the choice of conversion to Islam or death. While some converted under duress, many chose martyrdom, and they are still honored by the Assyrian Church as saints. Behind this tragedy were the architects of genocide. Talat Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of the Interior, and a key architect of the genocides against Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. Talat Pasha's orders for deportations and massacres directly targeted Christian minorities Enver Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of War, who was instrumental in implementing military campaigns against Christian populations in the eastern provinces. Cemal Pasha, as the Ottoman Minister of the Navy and one of the central figures in the coup. Cemal Pasha played a role in suppressing Christian minorities, although his direct involvement with Assyrian persecution is debated. While not officially part of the Ottoman military, Kurdish tribes were often employed by the Ottomans to carry out attacks on Assyrian villages. These tribes benefited from the seizure of Assyrian lands and property. As the genocide unfolded, the world turned a blind eye. Reports trickled in from missionaries and diplomats, particularly from France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. But the horrors were lost amidst the wider carnage of World War I. Russia provided some aid to Assyrian fighters, particularly in Urmia, where leaders like Aga Petros bravely fought back against Ottoman forces. But when the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, even that fragile support vanished. The Assyrians were left to fight alone. The Sappho genocide had a devastating impact on the Assyrian people. In the immediate aftermath, hundreds of thousands of Assyrians were displaced from their ancestral homelands, with many fleeing to Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. A significant portion of the Assyrian diaspora today can trace its roots back to these forced migrations. The genocide also led to a cultural loss, as many religious and historical sites were destroyed, and oral histories were disrupted. Subsequent generations of Assyrians grew up with the trauma of Sappho, and this collective memory has been passed down through the community. Many survivors wrote memoirs or passed down stories about the horrors they witnessed. And the legacy of the genocide remains a defining feature of Assyrian identity. Today, Assyrians are a stateless people, with small scattered populations in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, as well as a large diaspora in Europe, North America, and Australia. Today, the memory of Sappho burns brighter than ever as the Assyrian people fight for recognition of the horrors inflicted upon them. Sweden, Australia, and parts of Europe have begun to acknowledge the genocide, but the world at large remains silent. Turkey still denies its role in the genocide, erasing the bloodshed from its historical narrative. But the Assyrian people refuse to forget, and they will not let the world forget.